Chapter 11. Everybody worked at top speed, Driscoll fastest of all. He dared not risk the moment's idleness which would enable the suppressed picture of Anne as he had last seen her to push too far forward into his mind. He had another reason, too. Denham was plainly waiting for an opportunity to say how he blamed himself, how sorry he was. Driscoll felt he couldn't bear that either. The raft was finished quickly. There were vines in abundance, and the half-score of logs they required were easily found. This lagoon-like widening of the stream seemed a catch-all for everything that fell into its waters farther up. "How deep do you think it is?" Driscoll wondered. "Not over 10 or 15 feet most of the distance," Denham guessed. "But from the way the grass disappears in the center and the stillness of the water there, I think we may hit a pothole going down to the mines." "We can paddle a little then." Veiled in the still perceptible mist, the sailors clambered carefully aboard, each with a pole in addition to his rifle. There was scarcely room for the last man. He managed to get on only by the narrowest fit. "Don't get the guns wet," Denham warned. "Okay," said Jimmy for them all. "All set?" Driscoll looked around. "Setting pretty. Watch those bombs, Jimmy. Ain't I watching? All right, shove off." They were away with a jerk and a clumsy roll that all but toppled the hindside men into the water. These were saved by their poles and presently were shoving with cautious earnestness along with the others. Everyone was suddenly dead sober. The fog, a reaction from the forced bits of jocularity at the start, the thought of Anne, which was almost as heavy a weight upon the minds of the sailors as upon Driscoll's, all helped to darken their mood. The raft was no very tractable craft either, and the problem it offered helped to lower their spirits. "Easy now," Denham said. "Wear the balance. Don't let her swing." One edge of the raft went awash. "Keep your weight toward center," Driscoll cautioned. Well toward center. They were in the middle now, and as Denham had predicted, the poles found no bottom, not even a hint of one. It was necessary to use them as paddles, and this added to the danger of capsizing. The poles were badly balanced, and any sweeping movement that had real force behind it tipped the raft ominously. "I think I see weeds ahead," Driscoll said. "We'll find bottom there. What's that?" The stern of the raft had scraped over something. A knob? The upward jutting end of a water-soaked log? "Christ!" Jimmy burst forth. A strangled, raging bellow followed close upon the blow, and then a little astern reared a great scaly head and a section of a great scaly body. "Dinosaur!" Denham exploded. "By the power! A dinosaur!" His tone was a mingling of consternation and the triumphant excitement of discovery. The monstrous apparition threw the men into a panic. Paddles swung wildly. Only their unlooked-for arrival in shallower water where the poles served as props saved the raft. Even at that, it tilted precariously and one man was pushed off. By luck, his hand closed on a trailing length of vine rope and he dragged along behind, slowing the flight. The huge head curved to the water and dived. A broad, scaly back rose to the surface. Then it, too, vanished. "Push!" Driscoll ordered swiftly. "It's trying to come up under us. We're nearly there. Everybody now! Heave-ho!" The last pound of power went into a few final desperate thrusts. 10 times the power, however, would not have made their speed equal to that of the great shadow which moved swiftly beneath them. They were still a fair stone's throw from shore when the raft took a tremendous blow from underneath. "The bombs!" Denham shouted. "Save 'em, Jimmy!" Jimmy was barely able to save himself, and Denham's tardy snatch for one of the missiles missed, although he had dropped his rifle in the effort to secure it. Everyone was thrown violently into the water. The raft itself was torn into its 10 original parts. One of these toppled on the head of the man who had been towing astern. He went under heavily and did not reappear. The others struggled toward shore like scattering sheep. Well in the lead, Driscoll threshed forward at a racing pace. Already he had headed to where he might again pick up the trail of the beast god. Denham, a good waterman himself, was next. A little to the left went Jimmy, minus his iron burden at last. The half-emerging dinosaur still lurched among the fragments of the raft. The tremendous blow it had struck, the veiling mist and the shower of logs had brought a short confusion. Except for that, few of the men would have got away. As it was, all save one were scrambling over the far bank when the beast's head cleared. That one, the beast sighted, and to him it gave chase in a series of lunging, elephantine strides. Driscoll paused at the water's edge long enough to give a hand to Denham and Jimmy and one or two more, and with these as a nucleus swung left at a dead run, calling to the others to follow. As they ran, the ground ascended and the mist disappeared. Driscoll came finally to a high, narrow crest beyond which the ground sloped again down to a wide morass. It was a soft, blackish expanse with here and there areas where the surface had hardened under the sun and cracked into great slabs. Denham, joining him, stared at this and interpreted again as he had interpreted the appearance of the dinosaur. "Asphalt," he said. "An asphalt morass that was there before the first beast came into being. A sink of hell. There'll be thousands of carcasses buried rods deep in it. If we try to cross, Jack, we'll have to be careful we don't stick and sink too." Driscoll nodded and, turning around, shouted a loud summons. A curious phenomenon lay in the direction of the stream. Close by, clear sunlight flashed upon the brush and the wet faces of men who came breathless up to the rendezvous. Farther back, the steeply descending ground was covered by the mist which hung motionlessly there in a deep layer thick enough to cast a veil over everything. Through it, as through thin white smoke, more of the party struggled up toward the crest. Driscoll began counting these distant survivors and then the others closer at hand. "Look," Denham cried. Following his pointing hand to the far side of the valley out of which they had climbed, they saw a single figure, dwarfed by distance to less than quarter size, racing violently toward the trees. It was the last man. He had taken the wrong direction, and behind him lumbered a giant, huge-headed pursuer. "Stand fast!" Denham cautioned as Driscoll stepped impulsively forward. No one, he pointed out, could get there in time, and the others, gathering around, made that plain by their rigid immobility. The midget managed to get to a tree, and by a miracle of despairing strength climbed into its lowest branches. The dinosaur paused beneath and reached its vast mouth up with a seeming slow care. "Hasn't anybody got a gun?" Denham asked furiously. "They're all at the bottom of the stream," Driscoll muttered. "If we only had one of them bombs," a sailor cried, "we could run back and maybe do something yet." "I had to let them go to keep from drowning," Jimmy stammered. "That was a lunk-headed trick," Denham told him. "You could have saved a couple. You lost your gun." "Come to think of it," Denham admitted with a wry grin, "I did. Except for the sheath knives which Driscoll and several of the sailors carried, no weapons remained." They all stared again across the valley. Through the mist, the dinosaur's grotesque head reached up, until only a thread-like strand of light separated it from the man's body in the tree. A thin, distant scream drifted to their ears. Head and body merged. The little group upon the crest drew closer to one another. One of the sailors turned suddenly and violently sick. Another would have burst in fury down the slope toward his comrade, but Denham tripped him up. "We'll go along," Driscoll said, and turned back to consider the problem of the asphalt morass. "Scatter out, you men, and see if you can pick up a footprint." He himself felt sick from wondering how many of the crew were to go before they caught up with Kong, and how many afterwards. Thinking of the beast god, his mind called up the picture he had seen in the frame of the altar's pillars. The picture was so vivid that at first, as he gazed across the morass, he thought that what he saw was simply imagination. The shouts of the rest told him otherwise. The picture was real. The beast god they sought was lumbering toward them from the center of the asphalt field. Monstrous beyond conception, as hairy as any of the simian creatures of an African jungle whom he resembled in all but size, the fact that he picked his way with a slow, almost human caution made him all the more incredible. Incredible, too, was the care with which he bore Anne. His primitive brain valued this strange possession for reasons it could not understand. Much as a prehistoric woman might have cradled her baby, he carried the girl's inert form in the crook of one arm. Almost, the watchers would have sworn, there was purpose in the way his broad back was interposed between his captive and the vast pursuing beasts which plodded inexorably behind, doggedly wresting their great feet from the suck of the asphalt. These, obviously, were still more of the gigantic creatures which had survived on Skull Mountain Island from a forgotten age. Huge, four-legged things they were, with thick, short necks and short, heavy heads ending in horns. There were 3 horns on each head, short, pointed weapons which shook implacably after Kong. Both Kong and his pursuers were so intent upon one another that the watchers on the crest had gone unnoticed. "Down!" Driscoll commanded. "Down!" All flung themselves behind the concealing mask of some bushes. "If we only had our bombs," Denham groaned. "What are those brutes?" Driscoll asked. "Try?" Denham hesitated over the word he knew well enough but had spoken probably never, having always been content to leave it in the book in which he found it. "Wait a moment, I have it. Triceratops." "And what are they?" "Just another of nature's mistakes, Jack. Something like a dinosaur, but with their forelegs more fully developed. They got their names from the 3 horns on their heads." The pursuit had drawn closer to Kong. He stood now on a dry mound in the center of the morass. He had put Anne down on the far side of the mound, away from the Triceratops. The farthest behind of these was apparently out of the fight, and out of all other fights as well. It had lumbered into a spot too soft to walk upon and was speeding its own end by fruitless struggles. The other 2, however, were almost at the edge of the mound. Luckier than their companion, they had picked out dry paths and were sure to reach their objective. Already Kong was carrying on a long-distance fire. Great slabs of the hardened asphalt swung up over his snarling face and went hurtling down upon the Triceratops' horny heads. "No," Denham said as he watched. "I won't believe it. There never was a beast as strong as that." What amazed him, and all the others, was the power with which Kong cast his huge projectiles. One, striking fairly, broke off a horn. The Triceratops staggered, obviously hurt, and Kong redoubled his attack. The second of the 2 beasts swung grudgingly off to the flank and retreated slowly toward the watching group on the crest. The first also tried to retreat, but another missile hit it again on the head and it fell. Kong roared in triumph and beat his breast. "We'll have to get out of this," Driscoll said. "Creep back through the bushes." Triceratops? And what are they? Just another of nature's mistakes, Jack. Something like a dinosaur, but with their forelegs more fully developed. They got their names from the 3 horns on their heads. The pursuit had drawn closer to Kong. He stood now on a dry mound in the center of the morass. He had put Anne down on the far side of the mound, away from the Triceratops. The farthest behind of these was apparently out of the fight, and out of all other fights as well. It had lumbered into a spot too soft to walk upon, and was speeding its own end by fruitless struggles. The other 2, however, were almost at the edge of the mound. Luckier than their companion, they had picked out dry paths and were sure to reach their objective. Already Kong was carrying on a long-distance fire. Great slabs of the hardened asphalt swung up over his snarling face and went hurtling down upon the Triceratops' horny heads. "No," Denham said as he watched. "I won't believe it. There never was a beast as strong as that." What amazed him and all the others was the power with which Kong cast his huge projectiles. One, striking fairly, broke off a horn. The Triceratops staggered, obviously hurt, and Kong redoubled his attack. The second of the 2 beasts swung grudgingly off to the flank and retreated slowly toward the watching group on the crest. The first also tried to retreat, but another missile hit it again on the head and it fell. Kong roared in triumph and beat his breast. "We'll have to get out of this," Driscoll said. "Creep back through the bushes." Off to the right, through a fringe of trees, could be seen the rocky edge of a narrow, stark ravine, and at one point what looked like a fallen log led to the seeming safety of the far side. Driscoll pointed, and they all began sliding away. The ravine invited for a second reason. Kong, still roaring his triumph, had picked Anne up and was moving off. His course bent at an angle which, it seemed to Driscoll, would carry the beast god around to the far side of the ravine. Only by crossing on the log bridge could they keep in touch. At first it seemed that the surviving Triceratop would pass them by. It was some distance away. It too had been struck by more than one of Kong's asphalt slabs and had suffered injuries which held the center of its thoughts. "Keep down!" Denham repeated Driscoll's warning. They got a little closer to the trees. Suddenly, without reason, the Triceratop wheeled at right angles to its line of retreat and lumbered toward them. They dared not risk the chance that it would turn again before seeing them. All leaped erect and fled. And again, as with the dinosaur, all got clear except the slowest man. Glancing back in fright, this one crashed into a low-hanging branch, fell and picked himself up too late. He tried to swing behind the shelter of a small tree, but the blundering triceratop crashed into this and came down in a heap, man and tree underneath. Then, as the others watched, the beast rose on its four knees, felt for its victim with its long central horn, and gored him to death. Chapter 12. Stumbling toward the ravine, the weary survivors of the searching party showed none of the confidence which had been so high in them when they trotted away from the great gate. They were picked men. Every one had been proved more than ordinarily resourceful. Again and again, when confronted with sudden danger, they had revealed and sustained that high courage which is the adventurer's final salvation, more potent than any weapon. Cast away in any ordinary wilderness, they would have boldly combined their wisdom and ingenuity and won out. But here, for the first time, they knew the meaning of utter helplessness. Of what use was such guile and wit as theirs against the huge, fantastic beasts of this nightmare island? Their frail knives, too, were useless. As they ran, it was borne home upon them that along with their rifles and bombs had sunk their last hope. Armed with these, they could have fought on. Lacking them, they were as helpless as the trapped triceratop and its mate slowly smothering to death back in the morass. No one, not even the buoyant Jimmy, stood ready now to say that the odds were 50-50. Hard, sullen oaths dropped from their lips as they ran. Not oaths of defiance, but the bitter, resentful bursts of men who have been enmeshed through no fault of their own and who see no way of escape. Only Driscoll and Denham fought against this mood of surrender. Leading the tired flight, the young mate cudgeled his brain for the trick which would help his weaponless hands to free Anne from her strange captor. Trailing in second place, Denham ordered his wits to call up a picture of the trail they had taken out from the village. They must go back if they could. One man must stay and try to keep track of Kong, but the others must go back for more rifles, more bombs. Then they would have a chance. From the rear came the crash of a heavy body plowing among the trees. "That damn three-horned brute is hunting us," one of the crew called out. "Wait, Jack," Denham said as Driscoll started across the log. "We've got a minute. The triceratop can't cross after us, and we've got to talk." He sketched his plan in as few words as he could manage. "Right," Driscoll agreed. "I'll stay. You go for the guns and bombs." "You'd better get across the ravine," Denham said. "But we won't cross unless we have to. If that brute back of us will only get it into his crazy head that we aren't the ones who hurt him, we'll be saved a big walk." As Driscoll started across the giant log, Denham looked down. The ravine was very deep, with a thick deposit of mud and slime at the bottom. Alongside this reeking deposit, and indeed all the way up the steep sides, were narrow-mouthed caves and long, jagged fissures in the rock. Denham looked up from all this to watch Driscoll's progress with silent anxiety. He sighed when the mate got across. "Good boy," he called. "I'd have felt funny, Jack, if you had started to slip. That place down there is the breeding spot for the rottenest thing on this foul island. Look." As though exorcised by his pointing finger, a spider like a keg on many legs came crawling out of a cave. It may not have been aware of the watchers on the high margin of the ravine, but everyone would have sworn the thing stared up malevolently. Something which would have been a lizard except for its size lay warming itself on a sunny ledge. The spider moved toward it, then thought better of the impulse and looked about for smaller prey. This was provided by a round, crawling object with tentacles like those of an octopus. The spider crawled to the attack. Both octopus insect and spider vanished into a fissure. "I'm not going to cross that log with those things under me," a sailor announced. Denham looked back. The triceratop, in its short-sighted fashion, was blundering about at the edge of the trees. It had taken some time to lurch through the narrow woods, and now did not seem to know which way to go. "Maybe we won't have to," he said. "Stand fast. If we don't move, that half-blind brute may think we're rocks or tree trunks." The triceratop broke past the last of the trees, moved uncertainly, and finally began a slow advance, its great horned head lifted high, its deep-set eyes peering forward. "That settles it," Denham said reluctantly. "We'll have to cross." Obedient to his motioning hand, the men moved out onto the long bridge. They moved cautiously because of what crawled far below their uncertain feet. Hurrying them as much as he could, Denham looked back at the Triceratop, picked up a rock, and then threw the useless thing away. The men were grouped close together in the center of the log, advancing slowly. Denham stepped forward. "Look out!" On the opposite side, Driscoll stood motioning frantically toward the ground sloping behind him. He motioned again, and with a last shout caught a vine at the edge of the ravine, swung down to a ledge and flung himself into a shallow cave. Kong came lumbering up the slope, and at sight of the men on the log roared out and beat his chest. Stopping at a lightning-riven tree, he placed Anne's unconscious form in a notch as high up as his great arms could reach, and then lunged forward to attack this new enemy so unexpectedly appearing to threaten possession of his bright-haired prize. Still angry from his earlier fight with the Triceratops, he was doubly enraged now by the men, and at the further sight of the three-horned beast charging toward the ravine, his rage broke all bounds. Denham followed Driscoll's example and slid over the edge of the ravine into a fissure on his side. The men on the log could do nothing. To advance against Kong was impossible. To retreat was no less so, for the Triceratop, sighting his old foe, rushed up to the end of the log and bellowed a challenge. Denham and Driscoll, from their caves, watched the tragedy helplessly. To Kong, all moving beings in his vision were enemies, the men on the log as much as the beast behind it. He roared and beat his breast again. One of his great hand-like feet reached out as though he meant to attack at close quarters. At that moment, a maddened plunge of the Triceratop brought the beast jarringly against its end of the bridge. The men in the center clung frantically. The beast god gave his own end of the log an experimental shake, and when the men cried out and clung to the bark to one another, he began to chatter. Driscoll, from his cave, shouted menacingly. Kong caught sight of him, took a half step away from the log, but in the end refused to be diverted. Denham tried the effect of a rock, but that went unnoticed. Ignoring shouts and rocks, ignoring even the bellowed defiance of the Triceratop, Kong curved both forearms under his end of the log and straining upward got it off the ground and jerked it violently from side to side. Two of the men lost their holds. One grasped madly at the face of a prone comrade and left bloody finger marks as he went whirling down into the decaying silt at the bottom. He had no more than struck when the lizard flashed upon him. Driscoll, watching, hoped that the complete lack of movement meant unconsciousness, or better, that death had come immediately. The second man did not die in the fall. He was not even unconscious. He landed feet first, sinking immediately to his waistline in the mud, and screamed horribly as not one but half a dozen of the great spiders swarmed over him. Up on the edge of the ravine, the Triceratops stamped the ground. Getting no notice from his adversary across the gap, he bellowed uncertainly and began backing up. With a last bellow, he wheeled around and lumbered toward the trees. Kong lifted the log and jerked it again. Another man fell, prey for a new outpouring of spiders. Another jerk, and the octopus insect, along with a score of companions, began to fight against the spiders and the lizards for the booty. Only one man was left on the log, and he clung desperately. Kong jerked, but could not shake him loose. Nor could all the despairing efforts of Driscoll and Denham, all their shouts, all their rocks, turn the beast god from his purpose. The clinging man shrieked. Kong glowered down upon him, and in a culminating exasperation swung the log far sideways and dropped it. The end caught on the very edge of the ravine, and then slipped slowly off to drop like a battering ram upon the insects at their feast below. Driscoll, looking down in horror, found himself menaced. A spider was climbing the heavy vine which hung in front of the cave, and by means of which the mate had got over the edge of the ravine. Its lidless, protruding eyes of no describable color looked up unblinkingly. Driscoll drew his knife and hacked desperately. Before the vine parted, the spider had got so close that its soft exhalation was audible to the mate as it plunged back into the ravine, reaching futilely at other vines. Cold and shaking from the tragedy he had witnessed and had been unable to avert, Driscoll nevertheless put his mind to the rescue of Anne. "You go along," he called to Denham. "I'll stay here until that hairy brute clears out, and then I'll follow him. You come back with bombs and something to bridge the ravine. I'll try to mark a plain trail." "I feel rotten, leaving you," Denham shouted back. "It's the one chance! Shove off!" Driscoll called impatiently. He was so intent upon speeding Denham's departure that he was not aware of Kong's great questing hand until the director shouted a warning. The beast god had come to squat at the edge of the ravine and feel down into the cave for this other of his enemies. Driscoll backed up and, drawing his knife, stabbed shrewdly into Kong's dusty, hairless palm. The beast god jerked away and roared. Denham threw a rock. Kong brushed the spot on his breast where the missile had struck and groped down again into the cave. This time he snatched quickly, missed, and got clear. He snatched again and again missed. Enraged, he thrust his hand deep into the cave and began a slow, groping search. Driscoll stabbed, but the beast god ignored the wounds. He ignored Denham's rocks, too. Driscoll crouched in his shallow wall, stabbing hopelessly at every chance. Twice the huge, curving fingers touched him. Twice he dug his knife in and got away. Now he was in a corner from which the swinging hand barred escape. If he could cut the tendons at wrist or elbow, he might gain at least a moment. Crouching low, making himself as small as possible, he gripped his knife and watched for an opening. Chapter 13. The vague hurt of the riven branch grew to sharp pain as Anne came back to consciousness. She turned on one side, and the wall of the notch in which she lay met her eyes. Looking up from that, she saw only the sky. Where she was, she had not the dimmest notion, and for a moment she could remember nothing. She was bruised and shaken, and a pall of stark fear hung over her, but beyond that her brain refused to go. Almost ready to drop back into unconsciousness, she rested on her rough support and by a complete lack of motion soothed her racked body. Then, abruptly, a black ape-like horror filled her mind and she sat up screaming. Nothing was forgotten now. She recalled the smallest details. The especially bright flame of one torch as she had stood bound upon the altar. The red eyes which had burned down upon her for one instant, closed and burned again. The great furry hand which had reached out at first so doubtfully. The hairy corded shoulder upon which she had lain in the moment before all consciousness faded. The recurring moments thereafter when she had felt herself being swung along through the forest. Sitting up, she discovered where she was and had a fresh immediate cause for fright. She dared not jump. The height alone was a bar, but besides that, at the base of her tree crawled a snake whose head swayed up along the trunk. Moreover, there was Kong. Kong crouched at the brink of a ravine. His great bulk rested on strong haunches while a long black arm swung over the edge and groped persistently. In addition to Kong, there was a third living thing. Out from the bushes which covered the slope below Anne's perch came a grotesque, hopping creature of very little less than Kong's own bulk. Its long, slender neck scouted hungrily in every direction as it progressed upon powerful hind legs. Of forelegs it had almost none, only frail, claw-like members good for nothing save to lift food to its mouth. It was the mouth which caused Anne to scream again. Nothing she had seen was quite so horrible as that red aperture filled with pointed, carnivorous teeth, and when the long neck swung in her direction, she thought she was lost. At her scream, Kong whirled about. The snake, sliding off hurriedly, got a cuff in passing, but all the beast god's fury broke upon the huge meat-eater. Clenched hands beating a tattoo upon his deep breast, Kong lumbered to the attack. The meat-eater stood ground defiantly, and as Kong drew close, flicked out its snake-like head, teeth bared and gleaming. Kong swept the head aside and plunged in. Both creatures fell off their balance. Kong was on top, and for a moment it seemed that the fight was to be finished instantly. The slim, swaying neck was far too fragile to withstand for long. The powerful hands closed about it. But before Kong could make his grip sure, the meat-eater squeezed one thick hind leg up against his assailant's breast and thrust. Not even Kong's strength could hold on against the force of that drive. His hand grip was broken and he whirled backward, head over heels, to the brink of the ravine. "No!" Anne cried out. "No, no!" She wanted Kong to win. She had no thought that she could survive much longer the horror of captivity in his hands. But even that was preferable to the open mouth which briefly swung her way before it flicked out again to meet Kong's renewed attack. The beast god lumbered back, beating his breast and indifferent to all his enemy's blows. His roaring charge carried both fighters hard against the tree in which Anne crouched, and that long tormented pedestal crashed down. Stunned by the fall, Anne lay under the main trunk. That was barely held away from her by a short spike of branch. On top of the tree, Kong and his adversary writhed until a deadly hind foot parted them again. The beast god moved back promptly, but now he spent less time beating his breast to terrify an enemy which would not be terrified by such devices. He came in more deliberately. Any critical observer would have realized that Kong had met enemies of the meat-eater breed before and had worked out a technique of battle which served well when he was not too enraged to use it. Now at last his rage was in check. His eyes always upon the long flicking neck, he came in purposefully and at last reached, not for the head but for one of the frail forelegs. He twisted it furiously and leaped away as the meat-eater bit into his shoulder. Again he was in and again away. This time the attacked foreleg hung limp, and the meat-eater was in unmistakable distress. Now Kong once more dared a frontal attack. As at first, he plunged recklessly forward and fastened his black hands upon the darting neck. As before, the two fell in a heap and a great hind leg thrust against Kong's chest. This time, however, the coordination was not so perfect. The force was less, and as he went whirling back, Kong was able to seize the foot which drove him. That was the major advantage he had been seeking. The extended leg had so little power that he was able to twist it and spin the meat-eater over onto its stomach. In a flash, Kong leaped astride his enemy's back. His knees clamped about the narrow shoulders. His great hands reached up to snatch at the open mouth. Before the meat-eater could use the powerful leverage of its hind legs to shake off its rider, the hands found their objective. They closed upon the upper and lower jaw and pulled. Nothing could have withstood such fury. The meat-eater's mouth gave in either direction, and Kong leaped clear. Battering his breast exultantly, he roared and gibbered his triumph, while his foe rolled and threshed upon the ground in weaker and weaker convulsions. When the meat-eater finally stretched out in death, Kong drew close and gazed down with loud cheeps of pleasure. He waggled the broken jaws with satisfaction and looked over toward Anne as though to invite her praise. Anne, however, could indicate neither praise nor horror. Her overtaxed emotions had once more sent her into unconsciousness. Trapped by the trunk, which stood barely clear of her curving breast, she lay as motionless as the great creature Kong had killed. Driscoll lifted his head half above the margin of the ravine to watch. He could scarcely contain himself when Kong lumbered over and touched Anne solicitously. But he had reasoned his course out, and he stood by it. Anne had come unhurt so far. Her one chance for continued safety depended upon his own ability to keep track of her and upon Kong's temper. If he managed to trail the beast god, and if he did not provoke him to a furious outburst, Anne might be saved by the party Denham was to bring back. Driscoll was the more inclined to keep quiet because of his growing conviction that Kong had completely forgotten him. The ape-like creature did not make a single motion back toward the cave. With all his interest focused upon Anne, he curved his arms about the tree as he had curved them about the bridge log. Carefully, by deliberate inches, he lifted the great weight and swung it to one side. Only when it was clear of Anne did he lower it back to the ground, and then as gently as he had lifted it, and when the heavy tree trunk was carried aside, he lumbered back anxiously. As he raised Anne, his broad throat made curious, consoling sounds. Carefully, and as easily as a man might have raised a doll, he rested his prize against a shoulder and turned down the slope. Driscoll, behind the edge of the ravine, sensed a clear purpose back of the departure. Freed at last of all pursuit, victorious over the last of a succession of enemies, Kong, the mate felt sure, was going directly now to the home he had not been able to reach before. No longer fretted by the small, noisy man-things who had trailed him from the altar, safely past the morass into which the Triceratops had driven him, and secure from the hungry pursuit of the meat-eater, he was bearing his prize home. Driscoll clambered cautiously to firm ground. Advancing a little, he made sure of Kong's line of flight, and no less sure that it was not too fast for him to keep up with. Then he turned around and looked for Denham. The latter was up on the far side of the bank, waiting. At his feet lay a great coil of vine rope. He grinned down at it. "I got it ready while the fight was on," he said. "I figured that if Kong lost, maybe you could get Anne, and I could get one end of this to you, and we could do something." For the first time since he had left the village, Driscoll felt a surge of the old affection for his employer. Denham was, and no doubt about it, a man you could tie to. He got you into trouble, plenty, but he never stopped trying to get you out. "The stuff may come in handy yet," he agreed and smiled. "Leave it right there, and you shove back to the village." "I hate like hell to leave you, Jack." "What else can you do?" Driscoll asked. "The two of us can't catch Kong. We've got to have bombs to do that. You go get them. I'll mark the trail from here, and we'll save Anne as sure as anything you know." "I guess that's the only way out." "Sure it is." Denham stood looking at the resolute young face across the ravine. "Okay, Jack, good luck," he said, and wheeling around, went back at a trot toward the stream from which the dinosaur had pursued them. "See you later, maybe," Driscoll called, and waved goodbye as Denham vanished into the woods. A distant crashing sounded in the heavy brush far down the slope. Driscoll nodded. That would be Kong, headed for his hideaway. Close to the tree in which Anne had rested lay the meat-eater's body. Already vultures were on the thing, half-where, a dozen of them, and more were coming. From over the edge of the ravine, the sharp reptilian head of a giant lizard announced that the scent of fresh food had drifted deep down to the hungry things which lived in the slime below. Driscoll shivered and went gladly on the trail of his larger enemy. Chapter 14. The brush which grew thick upon the plane of the altar rose more often than not above Denham's waist as he dragged his weary feet along. Sometimes when it grew especially tall or when he bent in a moment of unusual fatigue, it concealed him entirely. Night was well forward, too. A dozen factors made his slow-moving, exhausted figure hard to pick up, even from the high vantage point of the wall. Sharp eyes, however, were watching. The smoky flames of torches marked the niche where a dozen sailors kept vigilant guard down by the gate, ready to pull its great doors wide. Other torches, flickering on high, told of more men leaning forward to peer from the rampart, and one of these last sighted the solitary walker long before he got to the cleared ground around the altar. "Yo-ho! Denham!" It was Inglehorn who called. His white cap swung dimly in a wide, encouraging circle. The torches became trailing arcs of flame as the crew joined in the shout. "Yo-ho-oh! Yo-ho-oh! Away there!" The figures on the wall vanished, reappearing almost at once to swell the ranks at the gate. The gate swung wide, and the loud shout rang on until Denham had struggled through the last fringe of brush and had slogged past the altar. Then, however, silence fell, as abruptly as the shout had risen. The whole group at the gate stood taut, gazing in bewilderment over Denham's head when the darkness there failed to reveal any others following. Inglehorn recovered first. Dropping his torch, he ran out and got an arm under Denham's sagging shoulders. "I've got you," he murmured, and all but carried his friend to a bench inside the gate. "Where are the others?" a sailor wanted to know. "Let that wait," Inglehorn ordered brusquely. "Get some whiskey and some food, and close the gate." "No," Denham cut in. "Leave the gate open. If Driscoll comes, he'll come in a hurry." "Where is Driscoll?" "Where's Miss Anne?" Lumpy added. "I said let that wait," Inglehorn emphasized. "Where's the whiskey?" While the bottle stood tilted against Denham's mouth, the eyes of the skipper and the rest searched his torn clothing, his cut and bruised flesh, his gray face. They waited fearfully for a beginning of the dark account of adventure they felt was impending. Inglehorn did not move the bottle until the liquor had dropped to an imaginary line drawn by a generously measuring thumb. With the final swallow, Denham shuddered, and wiping his mouth slowly with the back of his hand, leaned against the captain's hard thigh. "I could do with that grub you spoke of," he said. Inglehorn nodded and cocked a commanding eye. The man he picked out went reluctantly. He half swung back as the others crowded around for Denham's next word, but Inglehorn's sharp "shove along" kept him going. Denham straightened on his bench as the whiskey took hold and faced his crew squarely. "Well," he said, "there's no use trying to give it to you softly. Here's the story. Everyone's wiped out except Driscoll and possibly Anne. And I'm asking for volunteers to go back after them. Who is coming with me?" His audience, eyes shining under the smoky torches, gazed down uncomprehendingly. "What do you mean, wiped out? You mean something's happened?" "I mean—" The words caught in his throat and Denham stopped to swallow. "I mean wiped out," he plunged on. "Wait till I tell you what we ran into." That black, hairy brute you saw go off with Miss Darrow is only the beginning of what this hell-made island has to offer, and the men I took out last night didn't miss anything." He paused to order his mind, and then told them as briefly as a profound sense of responsibility would let him what had happened. Reaching the tragic crisis upon the log bridge, he gave every detail. "I want you to know just what you'll be up against," he said, "when you decide to go back with me." "I ain't sure I get it all," one of the sailors said. "How?" he ended lamely in a mumble of words. "You want to know how I got clear?" Denham asked. "Is that it? How I and Driscoll got away?" His nod of agreement had all his normal tolerance, as he set out patiently to explain the happenstance which had placed him in a position to leap to safety, and Driscoll in one of equal advantage while the rest were trapped between the Triceratop and Kong. "I don't mean to claim any credit," he emphasized. "If I had kept a proper eye on the bombs, we'd all be safe, including Miss Darrow. But just the same, it was because I was trying to see the others safely across that I happened to be off the log. And as for Driscoll, at the time he went over to the far side of the ravine, he was taking a far bigger risk than anyone who stayed behind." The man who had put the question nodded solemnly, and the others were plainly in agreement. "You couldn't have helped what happened," Engelhorn murmured, "no matter what you did." "Not a nickel's worth," Denham said confidently. "I'll tell you the truth. I'll never forget I was the one to take them into it, but nobody can say I let them down. And if I weren't here now, Driscoll and Ann wouldn't have a Chinaman's chance." "We'll never see them again," Lumpy declared blackly. "The hell we won't," Denham shouted and stood up. "We'll see 'em both. And quick! Skipper, I want a case of bombs fetched. I'm back-trailing on the jump." He looked around and repeated his earlier question. "Who is coming with me?" "Let me go, Mr. Denham," Lumpy begged. "If I can't get stouter, younger men, you can go and welcome," Denham said frankly. He looked up at the others. "How about it?" The whole lot of them stepped forward in a confusion of assent, casual, reckless, indifferent, or jovial, according as each man reacted to the sharp stimulant of danger. "I'll string along." "Hell's bells, why not? Seeing it don't cost anything. Might as well. I guess I owe the mate this one. Miss Ann sewed some buttons on my shirt once." Having had their say, their faces fell into a common sobriety. They had no illusions about what they would face if they went out, and as they remembered what had happened to their comrades, their humor and bravado died away. Engelhorn was among the volunteers, along with a persistent Lumpy, but Denham waved these two back. "I've got enough without you," he said to Lumpy, "and as for you, Skipper, you draw the same billet. You stay here and keep the gate. I'm fresher than you," Engelhorn pointed out. "But I know the trail. You could draw me a map." "Skipper, I wouldn't let the freshest man in all the Indian Ocean take my place," Denham said wryly, "not even if he was the best map reader in the 7 seas. "I wouldn't either, in your shoes, Mr. Denham," the skipper responded with understanding heartiness. Denham nodded and turned to the food the commandeered cook had brought up. As he ate, he gave his orders. "Get me a rifle," he directed, "and a full bandolier. Every other man take the same. A knife apiece, too. There'll be a dozen bombs in the box when it comes up. 6 of you take 2 apiece. And remember, all the hell we drew on the first trip came because neither I nor anyone else had sense enough to hang on to a couple of bombs. Don't you lads lose yours." "You think the bombs will stop those big brutes you told us about?" a sailor asked. The others waited expectantly. "Stop them?" Denham laughed. "Just one will stop the biggest of the lot in his tracks, even Kong." And in proof he retold in detail how the first huge enemy had been halted and brought down. "When do you plan to start?" Engelhorn wanted to know. "Now, on the dot." "Too soon, Mr. Denham," the skipper murmured. After his first shock and concern, he was chewing tobacco again in his customary placid thoughtfulness. This second wouldn't be too soon. "Figure it out, Mr. Denham. If you go now, you'll get to the ravine long before dawn. And then what can you do? Nothing but sit around, to be picked off by whatever comes along until you can see to follow Driscoll's trail." Denham hurriedly thought out a time schedule, and then he nodded in reluctant agreement. "But how I can sit around here, waiting for almost 4 hours, is more than I know." "Call in that dirty little witch doctor," Lumpy suggested malevolently. "He ought to be able to give us some tips. And if he won't, I know ways we can make him." "Where is he?" Inglehorn hadn't seen either the witch doctor or the chief for hours, nor had any of the others. "I knocked the chief cold just after you and Driscoll started off," he explained placidly, "with the butt of his own spear, because he acted as though he was going to follow and stop you, and after I did that the whole tribe seemed to get low in the mouth. I got the idea they felt trouble was coming and wanted to get as far away as possible." "I wonder where they could have gone," Denham puzzled. "I think a lot of the women are still in the huts. We've all heard sounds now and then. And as for the bucks, well, this part of the island back of the wall is pretty big and covered with brush. Hiding in it wouldn't be very hard." "You don't think they're planning a surprise attack, do you?" "Not if I know natives," Inglehorn said confidently. "And I think I know 'em pretty well. The truth is, they don't think they need to attack us themselves. They figure Kong'll do it for them. We've been pretty high-handed, first refusing Kong a sacrifice and then chasing him after he got one. Knowing Kong, they think we can't do such things without paying, and they think it'll be Kong who will be back to collect. And when he does, they want to be as far away as possible." "By the Lord," Denham cried softly. "They're right. Kong will be back. At least he will if we manage to recapture Anne." The sailors, busy with their rifles and knives, looked up in a total lack of comprehension. Even Inglehorn was puzzled, and after chewing a while he said so. "I don't see why. It seems to me he'll more likely be hunting something to eat." Denham, clinging doggedly to the theory he had revealed to Driscoll, shook his head. "Kong," he insisted, "is the one thing outside the wall that is something more than beast. He's one of nature's errors, like all the others, but he was nearly not an error. And in that huge head of his is a spark. Anne means something to him." Inglehorn made a doubtful sound. "Yes, she does," Denham declared. "If I didn't believe that I wouldn't have a solitary hope of seeing her again. You don't suppose he took such care of the native girls they tied to the altar, do you?" Inglehorn conceded that Kong probably hadn't. He had gathered in his brief talk with the chief that the natives had been surprised when Kong carried Anne with such care into the dark shadow of the precipice. He sensed that Anne was different, Denham said, seizing upon the skipper's concession. "He hadn't the faintest notion why she is different, and he doesn't in the least know what to do with her. But when he looked on her, something inside him gave way. It was Beauty and the Beast over again." Speaking solely to Inglehorn, as a matter of fact, the sailors, after listening for a little in perplexity, had shaken their heads and pushed forward their preparations for the hunt. Denham once again outlined his theory of how beauty softens and attracts and in the end encompasses the destruction of the beast. "He'll lose Anne in the end," Denham said, "one way or another. And after he does, he'll never again be quite the same king of the forest. Brute strength will have yielded to something higher, and by the extent of its yielding will be weakened for its future battles with other brutes." "A very pretty theory," Inglehorn murmured, "but in my opinion, Mr. Denham, it isn't worth the rust on a single hull plate. It's moon talk and nothing more. Kong was attracted by Anne's bright head, I'll grant you, but only because it was strange, only as a magpie is attracted by a shining stone, and he'll tire of her brightness just as the magpie does. When he gets hungry, he'll drop Anne, and my prayer is that when he does, Driscoll will be there to pick her up." "We can trust Jack," Denham said confidently. He looked at his watch. "I wish to heaven it was time for me to do my share." Chapter 15. Kong was following no beaten trail, but he left his great tracks plainly upon bruised leaves and broken branches and sodden jungle floor. Driscoll had far less difficulty in pursuing him than he had anticipated. Even without the telltale marks, he would have been seldom puzzled. Kong bothered so little about the noise he made that the crash of his heavy progress was often a guiding echo through the thick wood. It helped, too, that his gait was leisurely. He seemed in no hurry at all, and if there were enemies about, he certainly did not seem to fear them. Only one aspect of the beast god's march indicated that the district might not be as empty of dangers as it appeared. This was the fact that he traveled by no well-defined paths. All along the way there were crossing and crisscrossing of trails which could have belonged only to the great creatures of the incredible island. But Kong broke a way through virgin jungle. He used no old path which his enemies could have come to know. Driscoll found the pursuit so easy that on occasion he misjudged his own speed and got too close. He always had a moment of panic when this happened, and had to swerve hastily for cover. He was still convinced that his one hope of rescuing Anne, either by himself or by keeping contact until a larger rescuing party caught up, depended upon his success in arousing no suspicion of pursuit. If Kong discovered he was being followed, anything might happen. So Driscoll kept well back, following by sound rather than by sight. Around noon, despite his care, he emerged into one border of a clearing as Kong disappeared on the other. And because he had been so long without any reassuring glimpse, he risked the briefest of inspections. Anne was apparently still unconscious. He prayed that she was not merely motionless from fright. In any event, she made no movement while Driscoll had her in view. Even one drooping arm seemed utterly without life. She lay in the crook of one of the beast god's enormous arms. She might have been in a swing seat she rode so easily, the curved prop giving with every stride and every shift of Kong's loose-jointed body. The last pin had fallen from her hair and it foamed down her back in a bright cascade, made more bright by its contrast with Kong's black snarl of fur. One sleeve of her dress had been torn so that her right shoulder was bare. The soft, white rondure made another, more startling contrast with her captor's sooty bulk. The clearing proved to be the beginning of thinner vegetation. The trail, which had led for a time gently downward from the crest of the ravine, sloped up again. Gradually, the tangle of vines and lush undergrowth disappeared. The trees, taller now, stood by themselves with no cluttering brush at their roots. By mid-afternoon, Driscoll began to catch glimpses of the tip of Skull Mountain. And by that time, Kong's purposeful travel made it additionally plain that he was on his way to his lair. That lair could be nowhere except up the slope of the island's highest peak, Driscoll reasoned, some fastness accessible only to a mighty climber. Such a spot, far from the vegetation which nourished most of the other beasts, would be doubly attractive since it would have no attraction to draw the rarer meat-eating creatures. The likelihood of all this became more evident as the curious pursuit continued. The dogged man-animal clinging to the trail of an enemy 20 times as large. Toward twilight, the chase led more steeply upward through a boulder-strewn region, and Driscoll tired rapidly. His body throbbed from falls and blows of branches. He was hungry besides, and his feet and legs were numb from exhaustion as he stumbled along after the sounds Kong made. It was only tardily that he noted a phenomenon which confronted him after one long swing to the left. This was a great spout of water bursting from the very side of the mountain itself. A white, misty torrent. It had dug a deep pit under its point of egress, and from this it spilled into a narrow channel to tumble down and disappear into the jungle below. Upon Driscoll's mind, grown hard from fatigue, the existence of this stream made at first only the faintest of marks. A stream! But the mark deepened as it came to him that this might well be the beginning of the stream which far back widened into the lagoon of the dinosaur, and which still farther poured softly over that slide, leading down to the plain of the altar. He was contemplating this possibility when he rounded a jutting corner of rock and discovered Kong scarcely 100 yards ahead and in full view. Only a frantic speed which brought an added protest from his tired muscles got him back behind the shield of rock in time. Peering out from his hiding place, he saw that Kong had come to a fall stop in a great natural amphitheater, which was encircled in 3/4 of its circumference by a curving cliff. A broad black pool lay just forward of the beast god, and at this he was staring with greater and greater suspicion. It was a curious pool, as still as it was black, and seemingly without any source. At one point it came to within a few feet of the base of the cliff. High up on this last a ledge ran, and at one place the ledge broadened to make a wide platform before a cave. Nowhere was there any sign of flowing water which fed the pool. On the contrary, on the side unfettered by wall, Driscoll caught sight of a whirling movement which could mean only an outlet. An underground outlet of considerable size, too. The mystery broke clear for him then, and simultaneously he realized that his conclusion about the spout of water seen earlier had been only half right. The spout was one beginning of the stream, but not the beginning. That was here, in the black, still pool. From somewhere, doubtless from a source far below in the ocean's bed, this water welled up to the pool. There, through the ages, it had eaten away a fault in the rock to make a subterranean passage. By this, it broke at last through the mountain's side. Why Kong should stare suspiciously at this pool, Driscoll could not imagine, and he was all the more puzzled as he remembered the cave on the high ledge and the full significance of this dawned. For the cave was in a dead-end path. There was no road beyond the pool. If Kong wished to leave, he must go by the way he had come. And this could mean only one thing. Kong was home. The cave was his lair. And since it was his lair, the spot must be familiar to him. So Driscoll pondered, why should the ape beast be suspicious? Puzzled, he peered around his jutting rock. Then he saw the cause of Kong's delay. What had before seemed an added blackness in the deepening evening light became a solid something, a crawling bulk whose upraised head faced Kong on the rocky margin, while its serpentine length disappeared into the pool. Kong crouched as the thing twisted farther out of the pool. He gave back a few steps to drop Anne roughly at the base of the cliff. Leaping forward again, he stood erect and rolled out his deep challenge. Driscoll had never thought to hear that thunder of rage without terror. But when it beat upon his ears, with its accompanying tattoo of mighty hands upon mighty chest, he was no more than a breath away from a supporting shout. He had never thought to see Kong barring the way to Anne, with any emotion save hate. But when the crouching ape beast swung before the white shoulder which marked Anne's place against the dark rock, the mate could have cried out in thanks. Roaring, Kong charged into battle. Somewhere, upon a rock at the bottom of the pool, the monster's tail had taken hold, and this gave it added strength to meet Kong's rush. Kong fought with hands and long flashing teeth. Even more than these, his feet were factors. They gripped the uneven rocks and withstood the tug of the submerged tail as the monster coiled around the beast god's pillar-like legs and tried to slip back into the pool. Unlike Kong's earlier conflicts, this was a silent fight. The water beast had no voice, and Kong, after the first roar, which announced his assault, had breath only for an occasional enraged whisper. His teeth slashed at the crushing coils, and his hands struggled to hold the monster's head. Driscoll, watching from behind his corner of rock, could see no advantage on either side for long minutes. The coils seemed to bind as terribly as ever. Kong's teeth slashed unrelentingly, and his hands still fought the monster's swinging head. When the end did come, it came so suddenly that Driscoll had no warning. Kong dropped into a slightly lower crouch. His legs spraddled a little more widely apart. His arms snatched the monstrous head close against his deep breast. That was all. But in that all but imperceptible series of efforts were both the seed and the fruit of another victory for the Beast King who dominated the lost world of Skull Mountain Island. The water boiled as the monster's tail let go in agony. The huge coils dropped to make a writhing rest for the crushed head which Kong flung down. Kong swayed and all but fell. He was so drained of breath and strength that for a space he could not even step outside the twisting mound of flesh which still encircled his feet. He shivered, so full he was of the loathing his species has had of reptilian things since the dawn of time. But he was too spent to move. And when he had recovered enough to raise Anne once more to the crook of his arm and toil slowly up to the ledge in his lofty cave, he was still too stupefied from his struggle to look around for any other danger. For the first time in the long pursuit, Driscoll felt no fear of detection. He came out from behind his rock and, knife in hand, half considered an attack. But he put that thought down quickly. The great hands might have spent their best strength upon the monster, but they still had strength to crush him. Reluctantly, he drew back again into hiding and prepared for what would be the hardest hours. Now, in spite of fatigue, he must keep awake to watch and listen for the rescue party. More, he must watch and listen for the moment when Anne might need him. Where he stood was all darkness now, a safe hiding place from which to watch Kong's ascent to the ledge. Slowly, by pushing foot and lifting hand, the beast god made his way. There was no path, but each jutting rock was good for a gain of feet. Driscoll marked the course and told himself that if need be, he could climb it too. Standing finally before the cave, Kong put Anne down between his feet. As she lay there, unmoving, he drew deep breaths. His strength came back with every inhalation. His head began to weave and his arms to swing. The arms swung higher and higher, and then they were at his chest, drumming in a wild ecstasy, while from his swelling throat there lifted a long peal of triumph. High above, in the starlit sky, a great bird-like monster soared and seemed to listen. Kong redoubled his cry and flung it upward challengingly. Driscoll, in the darkness below, saw Anne stir and sit erect. Uncertainly, she twisted around to look up toward the voice above her. Then she screamed, as she had screamed on the plain of the altar. Kong broke off his own savage speech and looked down. In the faint light, Anne was now no more than a shadow, except where her dress was torn. There, however, her shoulder was white and softly gleaming. Kong squatted down. His hand went first to the foaming hair, which he last remembered as brightly shining. He pulled it, as though puzzled that a thing could be so different by night from what it was by day. He fingered it, shook it off, and reached out to the inviting whiteness of the shoulder. Anne screamed again. Kong snatched at her. His hand caught in her dress, and the dress tore in his huge fingers. More whiteness was revealed. Kong touched the smooth revelation. He pulled again at the torn dress. Then, holding Anne tightly, he began to pluck her clothes away as a chimpanzee might clumsily undress a doll. As each garment came free into his hand, he felt it excitedly, plainly trying to find some connection between the frail tissue and the whiteness he had exposed. Anne cried brokenly, and Driscoll, darting out from his hiding place, began to climb up to the ledge. There had been no sign of a rescue party, but he could wait no longer. His muscles were too tired to perform their usual service, and he slipped again and again. Once he all but pitched back to the bottom. Breathless, he hung for a space, and then climbed again. He was wondering dully why Kong had not heard him when, looking up, he saw the great face peering over the ledge. If the face had shown anger, Driscoll would have given up hope. It showed, however, only a suspicious interest. Kong had heard something, but in the darkness he had not seen. Driscoll flattened himself against the rock and waited. Suddenly, Kong's face drew back. Driscoll struggled furiously up the last few feet. He reasoned that if he had been detected, caution was useless. If, on the other hand, Kong had been diverted, speed might possibly carry him to his goal before any fresh suspicion was aroused. He pulled himself over the ledge in time to see Kong seize a great pterodactyl and begin its destruction. This time the affair was not a fight. It was too one-sided for that. The reptile had swooped down to the white form on the ledge. Kong had turned about in time and, seizing it as its long talons reached for Anne, angrily tore the creature to pieces. It was to this more certain menace that the beast god had been drawn from the uncertain danger indicated by the noise Driscoll had made. Anne was unhurt. As Kong lifted the pterodactyl clear of her, she rose and stumbled to the edge of the rocky platform. Driscoll risked a whisper. "Anne!" he called softly. "Jack!" She crept in the direction of his voice. Behind Kong's back they caught at one another. They whispered like two children in an ogre's castle of terrors. "Jack, I kept praying and you didn't come." "I'm here now, Anne." Holding her close, he pretended an assurance which he did not feel. "Jack, don't let him touch me again." He felt for his knife and told himself he could save her from that, at least. "You won't let him touch me, will you, Jack?" "Don't you worry, honey," he promised, and then, looking down, he remembered. The pool. "Anne," he whispered. "We're going to—" Kong had finished his latest task of destruction. Turning, he swung the remains of the carnivorous reptile over the ledge and saw the two clasped close. His throat swelled. His angry roar sounded. "Jump, Anne!" Driscoll cried, and with his arm fast about her waist, they leaped together.